Well, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, it's a great pleasure for me to be here this afternoon. I'd like to thank you for taking part of this meeting on the poles, the polar regions, so often overlooked in our own agendas and in the international agenda. This is due to their remoteness, of course, and the current geopolitical situation, punctuated by many tensions between the regional local powers. But it is also, and perhaps above all, due to our irresponsibility, because these regions play a decisive role in part of our future. It is therefore essential that we give them our full attention, that everybody, according to their own ability and with the resources they have available, takes action to support them. Because although the polar regions concern us all, above all, they are dependent on the actions of all of us. These regions in which the key challenges and key solutions in regards to our planet's health are concentrated. To ensure that they are preserved effectively, it is therefore absolutely necessary to involve as many people as possible. We need to continue to mobilize states, of course, despite the particular difficulties of our time. But we also need to mobilize businesses, scientists, NGOs, and other organizations, as we are doing in the Principality of Monaco by supporting polar research and organizing events and initiatives focused on the preservation on a regular basis. And above all, in the case of the Arctic, we need to involve the indigenous populations who have invaluable knowledge of these regions and their evolution, who hold the key to a more harmonious relationship with nature. The crisis we are experiencing is not only a technical crisis brought about by the overuse of hydrocarbons. More widely, it is a crisis of civilization and philosophy created by a negligent, even contemptuous relationship that we have with nature. We too often imagine our planet as it appeared several hundreds of years ago, an infinite entity with inexhaustible resources, a sometimes dangerous entity faced with which our reflexes was to protect ourselves to ensure our future. The situation has, of course, now changed, as we all know, and it is the human race that has become dangerous. This fragile planet and the future dependent on our ability to limit ourselves. To reinvent a sustainable lifestyle, we need to do more than just make adjustments. We need to rethink our relationship with nature in a spirit of unity, of course. And for that, we must draw on the sensitive knowledge and intelligence of those who have been able to maintain these ties. It has been fortunate enough I've been fortunate enough on several occasions to spend time in the company of men and women from these cultures, less reliant on technology. And on each occasion, I realized how valuable their approach was to nature, of course, and to our natural surroundings, and how their vision helps us open our eyes. That's why we need to listen to them, to give them a voice, allow them to carry more weight in the future, of course, but also right now. Not only in their regions, but more widely around the world. This is one of the reasons I've been supporting for several years the project conducted by the University of the Arctic, whose rectors met last week in Monaco. One of its objectives was precisely to help give a stronger voice to the Arctic peoples. Because it is, as we now know, for everything that is related to the environment and to climate and to oceans, we need to work on these issues all together. With you, with them, we can look forward to preserving these fragile and beautiful regions that we can see on the screen right now, which are today so greatly endangered. So with this, I thank you, and I leave you with Professor Rockström, who will introduce the panelists. And thank you very much again for being here this afternoon.
Thank you so much, Your Royal Highness, Prince Albert. One phrase, a word I catch is your point about irresponsibility. Not only the irresponsibility of risking the polar regions, and we are here to unpack the polar crisis, but it's also the scientific evidence, which Gail will be presenting just now, that we all depend on the Arctic and the Antarctica for our own well-being and resilience and prosperity. So irresponsibility, I think, is really an important key word to kick off this discussion, which we really hope will be a lively one. It's therefore a pleasure to give the scientific update, to kick us off, to present Professor Gail Whiteman of the University of Exeter, Professor in Sustainability. You're also the mastermind and ambassador behind the Polar Base Camp here at Davos. And for those of you who've been there, if you haven't been there, you need to go there because it's just fantastic. I've had so much pleasure to engage in science discussions up at the base camp. And over to you to give us an update on where we are.
Thank you, Johan. Well, good afternoon, everybody. Hello, Your Serene Highness, Prince Albert. Wonderful to see you again. Thank you for your opening words, and thank you for your deep ongoing commitment to polar regions. You are one of the key heads of state that really focus on this area, and we're all, as scientists, incredibly thankful. Now, I have been given the rather daunting task of actually summarizing both the natural science and the social science of global risk from polar regions. Now, for most of us, we are in awe when we see images like this. This is an incredibly beautiful landscape. It's a wonderful place. For at least two people in the audience, the polar regions are home. There's two people from the Arctic here with us today. But most of us see this and we think it's beautiful. Even when it's changing, it still is beautiful. But science is telling us that the polar regions are both in crisis, the Arctic and the Antarctic, and they are going to be driving global risk for all of us. And indeed, here, I am going to tell you today that the polar regions are actually the control center for our climate system, and they are undergoing such rapid change that we need to know a lot more about that today. Now, what do I mean by the control center? Well, first of all, if we take a look at the tipping points. Now, these are the Earth system tipping points, the climate tipping points that natural sciences have come up with. There are 16 of those. You do not need to know all of them. What you do need to know is that 9 out of those 16 are in the polar regions. And 5 of the 6 that are in red, those are the ones that are most close to the tipping point now. 5 of the 6 are in the poles. So if we are looking at the tipping points as being the control center, it is clear that the polar regions are the key magic buttons that we should be paying attention to. Now, if we take a look at temperature, again, we all know the temperature is getting warmer, 1.2 C warmer since 1880. But if we start looking at the North and the South Pole, we can see that the actual temperature change here is moving rapidly. What does that mean? Well, that means that the sea ice is actually melting. Now, since the World Economic Forum started in 1971, we have lost about 50% of sea ice. The Cryosphere report that was released at COP27 by scientists say that this is the first of the tipping points that is very close, and if not irretrievable now, from being crossed. Now, what does that mean? Well, again, it means we're in trouble, but let's look at it a little bit more. Volume, how much is above and below the ice, is also decreasing rapidly. 75% of Arctic sea ice volume is gone. Now, this is the Earth's big insurance policy against runaway climate change. Because of all that white bounces back the sunlight back into space. When it's gone, it's dark, it comes into the oceans, which warms the rest of the planet. If the insurance policy, 75% of it is gone, that means we're in trouble. It's not just the ice. If we take a look at also the land ice, so the ice sheets in the Antarctic and in Greenland, we can see massive declines too. You don't need to know all the details, but what we do know is that Greenland in May of 2021 has also been assessed by science as being very near on the west side of having close to a tipping point crossing. In the Antarctic, we have also reached record loads last year. And if we look at where we are now in December 2022, we are still tracking low. This is not good news. If we go a little bit deeper here and we look at some time-lapse satellite data on Pine Island, well, Pine Island is part of that didn't work. Pine Island, let's go back. Can we go back, please? Pine Island, this is a satellite time lapse, and as it decreases over time, we will see that this has actually decreased rapidly. And it is the fastest part of the Antarctic ice sheet that is melting and is responsible for 25% of the actual melt in the Antarctic. Now, why is Pine Island important? Because it and Thwaites Glacier actually holds back the West Antarctic ice sheet, that if it goes and Thwaites goes, sea level rise is by 5 meters. Massive problem here. And now it's working, thanks very much. Sort of. I think we'll move on. Yeah, it's too scary to show you, sorry. What else is happening? Well, this is permafrost. What you need to know about this is that there's a lot of it in the Arctic. And what that is that's permanently frozen ground. And inside that permanently frozen ground is enough carbon that's about 2 times the amount that's already in our atmosphere. As it thaws, it releases methane, which is a much more potent greenhouse gas. And that, of course, exacerbates climate change. Scientists estimate that the store of carbon that's in here, if it is released, it will eat up to 40% of the remaining carbon budget to stay within the 2 degrees. If we want to stay within 1.5, it'll eat up a lot more. It is not in many of the projections. So this is, again, a wild card here on climate change. What does it look like? Well, it looks like craters like this. They burst open. You can see the size, the scale here. You can see the land going up like this. This is under lakes and in the subsea in the East Siberian Sea. Methane is a wild card, and it is thawing too. It's not the only thing. We also have fires throughout the Arctic. This is in 2020. It was a particularly bad fire season, and we can see how the Arctic is on fire. Also, when the snow comes again, some of these fires go underground and keep burning. They're called zombie fires, which means when the summer comes again, it comes up and the methane is released. Now, this is the part of the presentation where my scientific specialty comes in. I'm a social scientist and I'm a business school professor. I am interested in the global risks coming from this. I am unveiling a sneak peek today of a new polar dashboard that is linking the global risk, the climate events from around the world, and linking them back to the poles. This is developed by Arctic Base Camp scientists and Earthrise Media. We have at least 50 data points on here, and it will be hundreds, where all the climate risks that you are worried about are being linked back to polar change. In a nutshell, what that means for all of us is that the SDGs from the United Nations are on thin ice because of the Arctic today, the amount of change. If the Antarctic picks up pace, these will be sunk. Now let's do a little bit of a deeper dive here into extreme weather. This is a NASA photograph showing the weather whiplash that has happened in the US in December. Extreme cold, then all of a sudden extreme warm, and then extreme rain in California. US President Biden has announced declared a state of emergency. This is coming from the polar regions. This is coming from the Antarctic, and it's not just in the US. If we take a look at extreme weather all around the world, the research is becoming stronger and stronger that's showing whether it's the cold spells that come from the polar vortex or the extreme weather that comes, Hurricane Ian, the cyclones that come in all around, and the flooding that comes down, we can see these are the poles. So no matter where you live, the poles are coming and they're calling. And what they are doing is devastating the way we lead our lives, grow our food, get our water, live in cities, and work. What happens, though, when things are on fire and when there's not enough food and there's not enough water? Well, what happens is that it moves into extreme pressures on food and water security. And as we move forward, we see people fleeing these. We see people moving and migration happening, often with incredible problems. Now, business, of course, is part of the problem. We all know that CO2 emissions are related to the changes that have been happening in the poles, but they are increasingly experiencing material risks from this, whether that is in disrupted supply chains. We saw the Rhine this summer in Germany, which takes 80% of shipping of raw materials through inland Europe, actually stopped because of drought conditions. It's not the only place. We can see the transportation that wreaks havoc when things like Superstorm Sandy come in. It is an expensive material risk for countries companies, in terms of agriculture, in terms of supply chains, in terms of water, in terms of coastal communities, in terms of real estate. It is a business risk that's coming from the poles. On top of that, we've got increased civil society protests to stop fossil fuel development, to shut down the factories, and really look at the impacts on the global economy. It's not all bad news, though. We do know that if we halve emissions by 2030, what we can really do is actually prevent the worst of sea level rise. We can actually make a difference. If we avoid the current path, which will definitely see flooding throughout key cities around the world, and actually go into that massive low carbon track, we will be in a much better position. On top of this, though, as we sit here in Davos, and we collectively try to figure out how to cooperate in a fragmented world, what we really need to do is to unpack the polar crisis. And today I am also pleased and delighted to announce a new World Economic Forum Hoffman Fellowship on polar issues that will help us do that. It's together with the University of Exeter, where I'm on faculty, and Arctic Base Camp, which is a science communication platform. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gail. This was, I mean, from a scientific perspective, just a brilliant overview. I think that this is what everyone should almost be forced to have as a coverage of the scientific evidence that the polar regions are planet Earth's ground zero. And I think this has been coming through very, very clearly. We all depend on it. These are global commons that we all depend on for our economic development. But people live in the Arctic, and not in Antarctica, but in the Arctic, 4 million people. And we're so privileged to have two in this room, but Aslak Holmberg, who's the president of the Saami Council, with us to share also what do all these changes mean for livelihoods in the Arctic, and what can we learn from indigenous communities. Over to you, Aslak.
Yeah, thank you very much, Johan. Päivä pohkaide mulla on skuvlailema Asla, neljäs Asla, ja podan Njörkkänis tienoleis. So, hello everybody. Thank you for the invitation to be here, and thank you for excellent preparing remarks. So yes, I guess I could call that I'm a salmon fisher caught in politics. I come from this village of Njörkkän, which is in the northernmost part of what is today Finland. I wanted to start by showing the map of the traditional Saami homelands, or Sápmi as we call it. Yes, as you can see, we live in 4 different countries. The Saami, we are the only recognized indigenous people in the European Union. And what does it mean to be indigenous people? Well, it means that we don't have a state. We are colonized by 4 states, and that means that we are not in charge of our own, or governing our own territories or livelihoods. So that's important to note while setting the stage. So a few words about the Saami Council. I believe it's not very known to everybody. So we are an umbrella organization of national NGOs, Saami NGOs in 4 countries. At times of peace we work also with Russia, but currently we're cooperating with our member organizations in Sweden, Norway and Finland. We are the oldest international indigenous peoples organization in the world. We work with issues such as human rights, Arctic and environmental issues, and cultural policy, among other things. So I think this is a picture that many associate with the Saami people, reindeer and reindeer herding. I will be talking about some changes that we are experiencing or have experienced in the Arctic, and then how are we adapting to these changes. Also naming some issues that we are facing, like indirect threats in the name of the green shift. So yes, this is Saami reindeer herder. It's reindeer herding is a key aspect of Saami culture, key carrier of our culture. It's also the main user of the vast tundra and forest areas in the north. While reindeer is adapted to the Arctic conditions, the seasons are changing very rapidly. We experience great changes during the winter season. We experience unpredictable weather. There is a lot of melting and freezing, which means that there is a layer of ice created on the snow, on top of the snow or on top of the food of the reindeer, so they will not be able to access lichen and other sources of food through the ice. We experience changes in the summertime. Some summers are extremely warm and the reindeer is not well adapted to hot weather. There is increase in the number of insects, which means that the reindeer do not have peace, or they get very stressed when the insects bother them a lot. Yes, this is a video from my home river, Teatnu. It's the most diverse Atlantic salmon river in the world, and our river Saami culture is, I would say, built around salmon fishing. So it is key for our food security and also for our knowledge and getting to know the territory. We have experienced a very rapid decline in the Atlantic salmon stocks, and as a result of this, now for 2 summers in a row, we have had a complete ban on salmon fishing. So you can imagine what happens to a community when they do not have the access to their key resource, to their main source of food security. So this has a very drastic impacts on Saami culture, but also for the municipality. On estimate, the municipality of H.S.H, where I come from, has lost 5 million euros annually due to the ban on salmon fishing. That's not all. We also experience a lot of pressure to our traditional lands in the name of the green shift. This is a picture from Fusen in the South Saami area, where the biggest inland wind power development was built a couple of years ago. Despite clear protest from the Saami community, whose traditional lands these are, the government of Norway did grant a license to build this wind power development in their lands. In 2021, the Supreme Court of Norway actually ruled that because this wind power development restricted the winter grazing lands of the Saami community to an extent that part of the community has to stop herding reindeer. It meant that they were denied the right to practice their culture. So the Supreme Court concluded that this is indeed illegal because the reindeer avoid wind turbines, so this is basically all lost grazing lands. And this state-owned company is currently running an illegal wind power park in the Saami territories. And nothing has been done, even if it's more than a year since this ruling. Yes, so one message that I want to bring here is that state regulations and laws are not keeping up to the or they're not protecting our fundamental rights enough. So it's important to keep that in mind. We're gathering here with a lot of international businesses and investors, and even in the case of Fusen, as we could see before, even if the company followed all the regulations and laws, then it was still concluded to be illegal. So it's essential to keep in mind that international requirements that are put on indigenous rights. So, of course, when we experience different kinds of developments coming to our territories, then we have to find ways to react. And just a while ago, you could see some, here again, pictures from protest. These are related to a mine on the Norwegian side of Saami territories called Nussir, which is a copper mine. So, of course, these are one of the ways that we react when we notice that ways of politically trying to have an impact don't bring results, so we have to find other ways to make a difference. So Nussir has gotten a license from the Norwegian government to dump mining tailings into this, which is a national salmon fjord in the background. So of course people are protesting this. So then a few words about adaptation. When the reindeer cannot access food, when they cannot graze, then people have the choice of either to let the reindeer starve or to bring them supplementary food. So this is a view that is very much of describing the everyday life of a reindeer herder these days. So a lot of more and more communities are finding themselves in a position where they have to bring supplementary feed to the reindeer. Once you start feeding the reindeer, you have to keep going throughout the winter, because then they get used to having food delivered them. So once you get committed to this, then you have to do this every day, no matter what's the weather. And of course, there is also a lot of economic costs increased by having to buy food for the reindeer. On some very bad years for communities who don't bring supplementary feed, they might lose half of their stock, which means that they have absolutely no income for that year. Invasive species is another change that we have experienced. This is pink salmon or humpback salmon, which has now taken over our river. It's a new species in the river, and it outnumbers the native Atlantic salmon species at the moment. So of course, one of the ways that we have to adapt is look at what are the climate winners, what can we use sustainably if the native species are declining. In 2021, when we had the big run of pink salmon, we were not able to fish that because of slow regulatory processes. So they were not able to pass the law quickly enough to make changes. So we were there sitting in the shore and watching our river be full of fish, which is a good source of food. It's not quite as valued as Atlantic salmon, but at least it would be a source of food for us, and we would have to be able to make the best use out of those available resources. So I'll be concluding here. This is a picture from Varjavuotna. This is sacred Saami stone, one of the oldest signs of civilization in these territories. While we are in the front lines of suffering the negative impacts of climate change, we cannot also be expected to provide solutions and sacrifice our territories in the name of the green shift. And it has to be remembered that increasing everything will not be a solution. So if you increase wind power development and electrify the transportation system, but at the same time you keep increasing the emissions, so that is not the solution. So we have to look at what is actually the solution. And as we are in a situation of very rapidly changing ecosystem, we have to have adaptive governance. And in this regard, we have to also include our knowledge systems, as was mentioned by our colleagues right before. We have to have those people who have the most intimate relationship with the environment, so that we know what will be the impacts. How do we change? Because when our environment is changing, we have to change our culture. So we have to be there deciding how will our culture change in the future. So yes, I think I'll conclude there, and thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Aslak. And I think this final part, Aslak, is so important. I mean, we have so much scientific evidence that we need to reconnect the world economy with planet Earth, and you've never disconnected. And there's so much learning to do. When I was chairing the Arctic Resilience Assessment for the Arctic Council, the #1 conclusion is that we need to recognize that indigenous communities are sitting with the tools to build resilience in these very, very harsh conditions. So anyway, please join me and Gail as well in a panel here. What we thought we would do is I'll just pose one question each just to prepare and open the floor for you guys to open up the floor. We have 16, 17 minutes, so it will be some time. So please think through what you would like to either comment or question. I'd like to start with you, Gail, if I may, because one of your points was that the polar regions are the world economy's insurance policy. And to me, that translates to actually us having to recognize that the polar regions are global commons, that we all depend on entirely for the stability of our economies. But that requires collective governance. And what are your perspectives on the governance challenges of moving away from the current inertia we have in order to manage the polar regions as global commons?
Well, I think that right now, if we take a look at the governance of the polar regions, it is not global, so to speak. It's certainly in the Arctic, it's nation state. Arctic Council, of course, is a well organized institution. But the poles are the fate of humanity. So many more need to be involved in those discussions. So for me, I think that's the real sweet spot. That's the real addition that the World Economic Forum could bring to this discussion. So sort of this multi-stakeholder convening of those interests where we can innovate and co-create solutions and actually mitigate as much of those risks as we can and adapt, because we cannot mitigate all of them. There are some things we are going to have to adapt to.
But would you find it, is your recommendation to kind of bring this into the United Nations somehow, or do we need a new framework, or what's the, or what should be the recommendation for the World Economic Forum in terms of the governance challenge?
Well, I certainly think that topic should be one of the things that we explore with the Hoffman Fellowship, for example. And thank you, Andre, for your generous support. You and Rosalie, you're here in the audience. It's not an easy answer. It would be easy to say, yes, the UN should pick this up. But we also know things get bogged down at the UN sometimes. COP15 with biodiversity, massive breakthrough. We can see the ongoing climate COPs are still struggling to actually get on the ground change. So for me, I can see that the amount of polar change that's happening says we have to do something, and we have to do it rapidly. So I would like to have experimental spaces where we can look at those governance challenges and rely on science and the knowledge of Indigenous people. So science is often not on the table, and Indigenous people are often not on the table, and yet collectively we know a lot about how fast these risks are happening. So I think that these groups should be on the table in that governance solution.
No, I totally agree. So Aslak, coming to you, so that was a very powerful overview, and you know, I get quite struck by the fact that you show how mining is changing the conditions for your livelihoods. You show how climate change is changing conditions, the whole energy transition and wind park developments. You're subject currently to multiple pressures coming from all sides, basically, ending up right at the heart of your Saami culture. And still you're talking in a very, if I may say so, constructive fashion on adaptive capacity. I think many of us kind of ask ourselves the question, where's the limit of adaptation? Do you see, what's the spirit in your community, and do you see concerns about reaching limits of how far you can adapt?
Yes.
And what would your recommendations be to close the doors of some of these developments, if any?
Yeah, I would say definitely we are reaching some limits, and there are communities who are clearly stating and demonstrating that if this happens, then we will no longer be able to practice our traditional economies and our livelihoods, our culture. And this has now been concluded by, I mentioned the Supreme Court of Norway, which has a case that concluded that this wind power development reaches the level of impact that means that the Saami are not able to practice their culture. So definitely this is one case that draws a line, saying that you cannot cross this line. We have another case from Finland, from the Supreme Court, related to salmon fishing, which also concluded that the complete ban on fishing salmon was a violation of our fundamental rights. So we have these cases that show that when there is all these different kinds of pressures, and we have to look at the cumulative impacts on communities and sufficiently demonstrate, are they able to continue their practices, or are they in a position where it's not economically viable to continue reindeer herding, for example. So yes, there are so many cumulative pressures to our communities that we are in many ways reaching the limits and having to say that we are no longer able to stretch any more in this situation.
Yeah, I mean, just to say that from a personal perspective, I would say that under such multiple pressures, you would have a strong argument, I think, to say that that means that you should at least keep the grazing areas intact, given that you have these multiple other pressures that you need to cope with. So it's a question of you don't want to pull the rug under the feet on all fronts at the same time. But anyway, we can, yeah.
And I would just like to add in, on top of the cost to the Saami culture, the rest of the world loses a tremendous amount if you can't pursue your traditional lifestyles. And what I mean about that is that while the Saami herders are out there, they are collecting data on ecosystem change on a daily routine basis that we cannot get from satellite. So if we can connect the dots with what your people know and other peoples know in Canada and Alaska and elsewhere, that is incredibly helpful for us to understand how fast polar change is happening. So it's a big loss for the world.
With that, floor open. Any, just raise your hand. There's a mic running around. If you have any, yes, please, Mark.
Yeah, I think we can, of course, learn from you for our relation with nature. Maybe also for our relation with money, because it's quite interdependent. What can you teach us about your relation with money, or how you've been looking at this?
Yes, that's of course a big question, and we've also been part of the market system in a way for centuries already. But I guess what I would want to bring into this discussion is if we look at the traditional economies and the thinking behind that, then the aim was not to increase everything and have more every year and have everything better the next year, but the founding principle was to have a balance, to adapt your ways of living to the natural boundaries, because it's something that is very clear in the Arctic that there are limits to how much nature can produce and how much we can take sustainably. So the capacity of the environment would have to be what directs the economy. So I guess that harmony instead of growth would be my main message.
Wonderful.
Thanks. Yes, Jade, please.
My question's for Gail. You're a professor at the University of Exeter. Have you seen a material shift in the way that youth think about the climate crisis? And if so, over what period? And how do you think, or what do you think is the most constructive way that youth can contribute to global efforts to avert the crisis and protect these critical ecosystems?
Oh, thanks, Jade. Well, I would say that I started my PhD in 1993 at a business school, Queen's in Canada, and I actually spent 2 years living with Canadian Indigenous people, the James Bay Cree, during my PhD fieldwork in the subarctic. And I was studying exactly what Aslak is illuminating much better than I have, about the natural approaches to management from the earth with Indigenous people. And I've always been from the business school, and even in 1995, when I was in the field, in the ice, in the winter, we were hearing reports from local hunters that the ice was changing. So that was climate change then. And people were falling through the ice in places they shouldn't, and then sometimes, unfortunately, dying. We didn't know it was climate change, but it started then. Of course, everything ramped up, and the scientific information became much more compelling, and I understood a lot more. And I can see now the shifts that are happening in the ecosystems. We can see it with our own eyes in our own backyard, and the science is stronger and stronger and stronger. Certainly through the business schools, they have also brought this on. When I was studying this in the 1990s, I was seen as kind of a real oddball, you know, the real ugly duckling that was studying something that was not about making more money, not about growth, as Mark was saying. So there's been a big shift. It's not fast enough. Emissions are climbing. I mean, bottom line is, until emissions start going down, it is simply not fast enough. So the idea that the poles are really the insurance policy, I think, has to come home to us, and that means we have to actually do something. If we're losing our insurance policy, we've got to either expect we're going to pay the price, and I don't think we can afford it, or we're going to have to do something about that. So the real issue now is about action, action, action. What's my role? Simply, I try to speak science to power. We have set up Arctic Base Camp here alongside the World Economic Forum since 2017. We've been camping that whole time. Well, we don't camp there full year round, but we do camp every Davos, and we try to make a bit of a difference, but I think it's up to this room to take it much farther and faster.
Ila?
Wonderful discussion. This is a question for all of you, but you've mentioned insurance policy, and I love that metaphor. But it makes me think about quantification and profit. You know, we're getting good as a society about quantifying the opportunity cost of emissions. But what about the cost of inequity? What about the direction of inequity and the degree to which the social transformations and the loss of insurance policy could be quantified in a way that maybe we can get business people's heads screwed on straighter?
Maybe I can start,
Aslak,
because I've used this metaphor of insurance policy when talking about areas, how the vastness of the Arctic areas used to be our insurance policy. So if one area is blocked under unpenetrable ice, then people were able to go to another area with better circumstances. But while we're losing more and more areas to development, so-called development, then this means that we are losing our insurance policy, and it's coming to your point on inequality. So we're definitely in a situation where we are losing our ability to adapt and at the same time having to deal with all the major changes that we're experiencing.
Yeah, I think I agree very much with that point. And just to expand on it, I think we need transdisciplinary science. I think we need the social sciences to come in much stronger on the polar agenda. I'm not a natural scientist on the poles. I'm a social scientist that's worried about global risk. Yes, I did my PhD in the field of the subarctic, so I have some familiarity, and I certainly know the natural science in many ways, but we need the social sciences, and it's got to come together. It cannot be separated out, so we need to address that. I don't have a simple answer now.
Yes.
Hi. You know, you speak of action, and it's about messaging. And as a filmmaker, I'm looking at this and saying, okay, now how do we get to everybody with that message? And what would Santa Claus be without reindeers? So you've got to call every kid, every parent, and if the kids say, hey, the reindeers don't have any food, and they see some little image or some story, that's going to make a difference. So.
Thank you.
Something to think about.
No, that's a very, very important reflection. Yes, over here.
Is there any research or any thinking about geoengineering we might do to at least slow the loss of the Arctic? Obviously, the real issue is carbon emission, but there's nothing in the Arctic that is going to change that. So my question is there any thought to some geoengineering that might be done?
Yeah, I can start with that. I think certainly the conversation on geoengineering is out and about. You'll hear it in many different forums. I think the actual research is incredibly inconclusive, and some of the new research that I have seen is actually really worrying. It's showing that the geoengineering silver bullets are unlikely to work in the Arctic specifically, I'm talking about, and in fact they could have some really severe unintended consequences which are worrying. So I'm not saying it shouldn't be studied. I think it should be studied, obviously. My concern is that we need to walk through with a very scientific framework to make sure that we don't walk into that don't look up moment where we thought the high-tech guy was going to do it and he didn't. You know, so from my perspective is I think it needs research, but right now the stuff that I'm seeing is really worrying. It's not the silver bullet that's going to save us.
Final quickie.
Oh yeah, Harmony from Alaska.
The microphone, Harmony.
I think I'm one of the other two people that the Arctic is home here. But I was wondering about what the role is of the Saami Council in natural resource management, because you said there's slow regulation changes to the climate change in terms of the subsistence resources that you depend on. And I can see a lot of familiarity in Alaska, but we're working with at least the same nation.
Yeah, thanks for the question. As we are a non-governmental body, it means that we are not governing, but we are finding other ways to contribute. For example, we are working a lot with knowledge production, with exactly what you were talking about, Gail, on how to, in best way, combine different sciences and different ways of knowing. And also we are working in developing this kind of community-based monitoring that can be done by reindeer herders when they're out in the field, in the tundra, and finding and providing ways for them to prove what is changing and what are the impacts of the change, because you have to take that into account when you're evaluating the whole big picture and the cumulative pressures we were talking about.
Thanks a lot. During the pandemic, we've all, as citizens on Earth, learned that when something goes wrong in one corner of the planet, it can hit the entire world economy very, very fast. And I think what we've learned here today is that it's exactly the same thing with the polar regions. If it goes wrong with the polar regions, it will hit us all. It will hit us all irreversibly, and it will really undermine our abilities for prosperity and equity in the future. So I think the key words here on irresponsibility, Prince Albert's point from the beginning, balancing, I think that is fundamental here, and insurance policy, or resilience, if you want to call it that way. We are in the scientific community very supportive of ramping up the ambition of a strategic engagement on addressing the polar crisis, the fact that we as humanity depend on stable ice sheets in the Arctic and Antarctica, and need to take this as a social ecological responsibility. If this can be the starting point of this, our fusion discussion here today, I think we all would very strongly welcome that. Thanks again, Andre Hoffman, for your support here. Prince Albert, it's just invaluable, and thanks for this dialogue. It will continue, and let's ramp it up. Jill, thanks for your leadership on this. Thank you very much, everyone. And Aslak and Gail.
And of course,